Hi, my name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to the History Squad. Now, today's episode has been voted in by our Patreon members. Hey, guys, thanks a million. This is all about the life and times, the loves, and the children of Eleanor of Aquitaine. This is a woman who was married to two kings, and two of her sons become kings. So let's have a little look into the story, the life of Eleanor of Aquitaine. So Aquitaine, before I go any further, right, Aquitaine. In the 1100s, 1200s, France was not the France of today. It was not this great big united country. It had different provinces, dukedoms. Aquitaine was one, Normandy another, Brittany. So you had these different parts, and one of them around Paris was France. So Eleanor of Aquitaine, she was born in Aquitaine, 1124. She has a father, William X, Duke of Aquitaine, but he's not very well. And he comes up with the idea that his daughter, of course, she's still very young, she's only 12, 13, she will be vulnerable if he dies. So he decides to hand her over into the care of the King of France at the time, who was Louis VI, known as Louis the Fat. And he comes up with the idea, wow, what a great idea. I could marry this Eleanor to my son Louis. When he becomes Louis VII, he will then take control of her lands, these wonderful part of France, and it will unite the French and Aquitaine. And so he does. Eleanor of Aquitaine will marry Louis VII. Well, he's not quite the 7th yet. This is 1137. They marry. And she is between 13 and 15 years of age, and he's not much older. But there's a problem here. Louis, the new husband, was raised to be a monk. He was going into the church, but through deaths of his elder brother, he suddenly finds himself thrust into the limelight. He is married, but he'd been taught that sex was just to make babies. It was not to be enjoyed. He often used to dress as a monk. So poor old Eleanor, this lovely teenage girl, and if you're to believe half the things that are written about her, she was beautiful and she did enjoy the company of men. So I think she's going to be just a little bit disappointed at first. On her marriage, Eleanor presented to her husband Louis a gift. This gift is still in existence. In fact, it's the only physical thing that remains of Eleanor of Aquitaine. It was a rock crystal vase, and it now stands proudly in the Louvre Museum in Paris, in France. Now, Louis VI dies in August of that year, and his son, Louis, now Louis VII, had already been crowned before. This was in the fashion of the day. You crowned your son before you died. Now, Eleanor was crowned Queen of France, 1137, on Christmas Day. But there's an interesting point here. She did not hand over her lands to her husband. So the King of France, Louis VII, did not become King of France, Duke of Aquitaine. No, that was to wait one generation. When they had a son and he was crowned king, he would become King of France and then the Duke of Aquitaine. So Eleanor regains the rights to her land. Now her husband will govern them as her husband. But if anything should happen, his death or something else, she would retain her lands. That is a very important point. Eleanor of Aquitaine was often at odds with the church, not all of the time, but often at odds with the church. And this occasion, it was over the marriage of her sister Petronilla to the king's cousin. Now, the king, don't forget, was her husband, Louis VII. His cousin, Roel, was going to marry Petronilla. Petronilla was 15, Roel was 50. However, he was already married. He was married to the niece of Count Theobald of Champagne. This means that the marriage is a bit illegal. The church are not happy. But Louis now sees an opportunity where there might be some land to be grabbed. So he supports his wife in her support of her sister's marriage, and there is war in Champagne. In fact, in Vitry, the capital of Champagne, Louis VII's forces attack. The people inside, terrified for their lives, crowd into the church. Around 1,500 of them crowd into the church, and Louis's forces set fire to it and burn them all alive. This is an atrocity. Louis VII, who has been raised to be more of a monk than a warrior, is horrified. And he pledges that in penitence he will go on crusade. Now there's another twist in the tale here, because Eleanor of Aquitaine is told, you're not having any children because you're rebelling against the church. If you come onto the side of the church, things will improve for you. They failed to notice the fact that her husband was acting like a monk and hardly ever came to her bed. But that's a whole different story, because what's looming now in Eleanor's future is the Second Crusade. Eleanor does as she's told. She will doff her cap to the church, shall we say, and she will eventually give birth to 2 daughters, fathered by Louis. There will be Marie, who will eventually become the Countess of Champagne, and then there will be Alex, who will become the Countess of Blois. But in 1145, they take the cross, Louis and Eleanor of Aquitaine. They become crusaders. Now, this isn't a small thing. This is a massive thing. Now, Louis is leaving the throne of France in the hands of the church. The journey alone is months upon months going across land to Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul. As they go across there, people note the size of Eleanor's contribution, contained within this crusade of between 25 and 50,000 crusaders and pilgrims. There is a contingent of crusaders from Aquitaine. So she kind of commands those. But in her retinue, they say there's anything up to 300 women and an enormous baggage train. Now, when they arrive at Constantinople, it soon becomes apparent that the Byzantine people don't like the French and the French don't like them. Now add the Germans to this, because there were German crusaders there. The Germans aren't fond of the French aren't fond of the Germans, and the Germans aren't fond of the Byzantines. In fact, a German crusader steals money from a Byzantine moneylender. He is captured, he is found guilty, he is hanged. There is problems. So the Germans will leave early and off they go. Meanwhile, the French are waiting for their people to catch up who've come by ship, and news arrives that there has been a great victory. The German crusaders have defeated, slaughtered a massive Turkish army. The French, Louis, is eager to get on and join in the spoils of war. His troops catch up and off they go. But there's an interesting little piece here. It's a description of Queen Eleanor and her ladies riding out of Constantinople. They are described as riding astride their horses, armoured up with sword and lance, and Queen Eleanor is seen striding ahead of her army like the queen of the Amazons of mythology. Well, that's nonsense. Those were ladies of the court, and they would have ridden side saddle. However, there were ladies apparently in the German contingent who did ride astride their saddles and were armed or armoured up. So maybe that's the mistake that's been made. But anyway, off the French go. Now there were incredible distances to be covered from Constantinople. It's going all the way through modern-day Turkey, then through Syria into the Holy Land. And on the way, the French discover that in October 1147, the Germans had suffered an incredible defeat, almost a massacre, at the Battle of Dorylaeum. The French have got problems. Their army is strung out, and on January 1148, they are caught at Mount Cadmus. The Turks attack their baggage train. Then they attack the rear echelon of their army. Louis escapes with his life. Many crusaders are killed, but sadly, many unarmed pilgrims are slaughtered. Interestingly, the similar thing happened at the exact same place on the First Crusade. It's obviously here somebody was not reading their history. There was lots to blame here. Oh, the foreguard, they went on ahead, blah, blah, blah. Lots of blame. They even later blame Queen Eleanor. Her baggage train was so long, so big. Well, actually, it lies at the feet of one man, Louis VII. He was not a very good leader. So now the French must gather themselves together, recover from this defeat, and march on to Antioch, which will be the next stage of their crusade. By the time the French had arrived at Antioch, they were well behind schedule. In fact, this army and pilgrims had lost half of their numbers on the way to the Holy Land. Louis's intention was to move on his personal pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but don't forget they were on the Second Crusade. And Raymond of Antioch, who was Eleanor's uncle, held lots of titles in France. He was keen for the French forces to join his and move on and attack Aleppo so they could capture the county of Edessa, which was Crusader land, Christian land, which had been lost to the Muslims. This was the whole idea of the Second Crusade, to regain lost Christian lands. But there was a rift growing between Louis and his wife Eleanor. She was spending more and more time with her uncle. Now, there is the rumour, and it's quite strong, that she had an incestuous love affair with Uncle Raymond. We will never know the truth, but the fact is, she was spirited away against her will by her husband and his forces. They will move on to Jerusalem. The French, on their Second Crusade, suffered defeat after defeat until they finally returned to France. And Louis, in his haste to get home, deserted many of his troops and many of his people who would fall to the swords of the Turks. You know, it just goes to show how the story of Eleanor has been added to, has been embellished over the years. One of the things I read was that Queen Eleanor, while she was in the Holy Land on the Second Crusade, had an affair with Saladin himself, Saladin. Yeah, okay, he was in Damascus. She never went to Damascus. And there's another little tiny thing. He was only 10 at the time. You mustn't believe everything that you read. So, when they leave the Holy Land, Louis goes on one ship and Eleanor on another. And nature intervenes and Eleanor's ship is blown off course, ends up in Sicily. The couple are reunited at a palace just south of Rome. It's the Pope Eugenius, it's his place. And he finds out from Queen Eleanor's servants that the pair are not having sex. That's why they're not having a baby. He figures it out, and there's an annulment is discussed. But the Pope has a quiet word with Queen Eleanor. Look, you know, you've got to try a little bit harder. How about if I have a word with your husband? That kind of stuff. And it works, because the Queen falls pregnant, and eventually Alex, the second daughter, is born. But the problem is, of course, is they've been married, 13 years? The Queen is 26 years of age, and he's unlikely to produce a male heir. It's that old thing, isn't it? Oh, it was a girl. And on top of this, just a little bit later, rumours of another affair come to light. It was Henry, Count of Anjou. Now, these rumours come from Gerard of Wales, who was a monk, and that after the fact. And it's thought that these rumours came about to discredit Queen Eleanor. In March 1152, the marriage is finally annulled on the grounds of, get this one, consanguinity. I think I got it right. It means that you're too closely related to your spouse. Now, an interesting twist, because there is already an agreement in place that she will marry Henry of Normandy if her marriage with Louis fails. The problem she's got is she's got to get to him first, let him know that the marriage has been annulled, because she is in great danger now. She could be kidnapped, because don't forget, she still retains her lands. Aquitaine, this great rich piece of land of France. Any count, any duke could kidnap her, force her into marriage. He is hers, he can claim her land. She has to avoid it. And this part of her life, there is little adventures here. In fact, she is saved by William Marshall, a young knight at the time. You can see all about that episode in my film about William Marshall. She is eternally grateful to him and earns the rumour that she's had an affair with him. Yeah, I don't think she actually had time, because she was on her way down into Poitiers, get the message to Henry that she's free. He races to her side, and the pair of them are married in a quiet ceremony in Poitiers Cathedral, and the page of history will turn, because Henry will become Henry II, King of England, and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, will become Queen of England. So the happy couple, Henry of Normandy and Eleanor of Aquitaine, were married in that quiet ceremony on the 18th of May, 1152. Only one tiny little thing, it's a bit of irony really, that Eleanor was closer related to Henry than she had been to her first husband, Louis. Hey, get over this. Louis was furious because they should have gained his permission before they married, but they didn't. And Louis now, he's so angry, and just as Henry is about to embark to England to pursue his claim on the throne of England, Louis invades Normandy. There is war, but he's easily repelled because Louis is not a very good leader, whereas Henry was a fighter. In January 1153, Henry sails for England, pursuing his claim to the throne, leaving his pregnant wife Eleanor behind with his mother, the Empress Matilda. Over in England, a civil war had been raging. It was horrendous. It was called the time of anarchy. It was between Empress Matilda's forces and King Stephen, and it was all over who was going to be the King of England. Now, Henry had spent a year fighting King Stephen in England, and this led to the Treaty of Winchester in 1153. The terms of this treaty were quite straightforward. King Stephen would stay on the throne. When he died, Henry will be his heir and successor to the throne of England. He will become Henry II. Henry returns to France, meets his newborn son. William makes his wife pregnant again. There's a bit of a pattern emerging here. Now, at this time, King Louis of France remarries and becomes reconciled with Henry and Eleanor. Now, in October 1154, King Stephen dies. A little bit later on, due to stormy weather, I think it was the 7th of December, the happy couple sailed to England. And on the 19th of December, 1154, Henry is crowned King Henry II of England, and by his side, his Queen Eleanor, Queen Eleanor of England. Henry and Eleanor would go on to have 8 children, boys amongst them. And that's ironic, isn't it? Because at the age of 26, married to Louis of France, they reckon she'd have no male heirs. Well, the marriage is annulled. She's married to Henry of Normandy. Their firstborn is called William. It's a boy. And he's followed by Henry. Oh my goodness me, 2 boys. But then unfortunately, William dies. But next, she has a daughter, Matilda, followed by Richard, and then Geoffrey, and then another daughter, Eleanor. Henry now is away 4 years. Eleanor joins him in France. She becomes pregnant. That's with their daughter, Joanna. But there's a war raging in France now between England and France. Between Henry and Louis, it starts with, over control of land. Do you know that war will last 40 years? So there are more and more periods when Eleanor and her husband Henry are actually apart. It soon becomes apparent that Henry is having an affair with Rosamund Clifford. This is a long-term affair. Now, in Easter 1166, he does come home to England and spends Easter with his wife. And, of course, she becomes pregnant at the age of 42. She gives birth to their last child, and it's a son, John. After the birth of their son, John, King Henry II and his queen, Eleanor, Queen of England, would spend more and more time apart. In fact, one of their lengthy times apart was 5 years. Now, during this time, there's a problem with the young King Henry. Now, 1170, Henry had been crowned titular King of England, Duke of Normandy, and Count of Anjou and Maine. These are just puppet positions, if you like, getting him ready for when his father dies. There was no money and there was no power. And young Henry rebelled against this. And he built up support, rebelled against his father. And he was quite successful, almost toppling his father from power. But unfortunately for him, his mother, Eleanor, who was supporting him, was captured by forces loyal to Henry II. And she was then taken to her husband and imprisoned at Rouen. The young king now, devastated that his mother has been captured, is reconciled with his father. But that's not the end of the matter with the young King Henry. He died in 1183 from dysentery, whilst on campaign against his father and his brother Richard. His dying wishes were that his mother be released. When Eleanor was captured and given over to her husband at Rouen, he had her transported over to England with their two youngest, John and Joanna. She was put into confinement where she would be held for 16 years, but not in the same place. She would be moved around and it was house arrest. She would have freedom. She would have her staff around her. In fact, occasionally she was brought over to France to settle local disputes in Aquitaine, that kind of thing. But while she was in confinement, she would live through the death of two of her sons, Henry and Geoffrey, and her daughter, Matilda. This must have cut right through her. But there was another death while she was held in captivity, and that was the death of the king's mistress, Rosamund, around 1176-77. She died in Godstow in Oxfordshire, and there is accusations, much later, of course, levelled at Eleanor that she had something to do, something sinister to do with the death of Rosamund. There's no evidence to this, in my opinion. It's just nasty rumours. With the death of young Henry, Richard now becomes the heir apparent to the crown of England and the titles held in France. But there is a twist here. You see, Richard was betrothed to Elise, who was the daughter of the King of France, Louis VII. But apparently his father, Henry II, in his 50s, has an affair with this young 16-year-old girl and fathers a child by her. So you can imagine that Richard distances himself from that proposal. But legally, he is bound to that betrothal. But there is a financial settlement and Richard ends up marrying Berengaria of Navarre. This is a great story, isn't it? But Henry II dies on campaign at Chinon in France in July 1189. I think it was the 6th of July 1189. He was age 56. This means now that Richard, Eleanor's son, is the undisputed successor to the throne of England and to the titles and lands of Henry II in France. On the death of her husband, Eleanor is immediately released, and she will rule England as regent when Richard I is out on the Third Crusade. It's an interesting thing, she used to sign her name to official documents. Eleanor, by the grace of God, Queen of England. I think this is brilliant. But when Richard was captured in Austria on his return for the Crusades, Eleanor asks the Pope for help. You see, Crusaders were supposed to be guaranteed safe conduct to and from home, but the Pope didn't offer any help. She was instrumental in locating where her son was being held in Austria and also in raising the enormous ransom, both money from her holdings in France, Aquitaine, as well as England, to pay for his release. When Richard was wounded at Chalosse on March 1199, Eleanor hastens to his side. Now, they captured the man who shot Richard, Bertram de Gildon. And Richard asked him, so why did you shoot me? And he says, by your own hand you killed my father and brothers. Richard ordered his release, and he was to be given 100 crowns, but actually this didn't happen. Bertram was actually flayed alive and either beheaded or hanged. Eleanor cradled her son, who died in her arms, but just before he died, he changed his mind about who should succeed to his land and titles. It should have been Arthur, Eleanor's grandson, but he changed it to John, his brother. So when he died on that 6th of April, Eleanor had to move very quickly, and she was instrumental in persuading the English barons that John was the rightful king of England. John was crowned king on the 27th of May 1199, and Eleanor declared that she would cede her French lands to him upon her death. In other words, she retained control of Aquitaine until her death. Now, John was a bad king. There's no two ways about it. He caused the Barons' War and ended up signing the Magna Carta and then going against it afterwards. In fact, one of his only successful acts as a soldier was when he at the Battle of Mirabeau, where his mother was being laid siege to by her grandson Arthur. John's forces were successful in relieving the siege and rescuing his mother. Arthur was captured and mysteriously was murdered in the castle of Rouen. But I understand that it was John who, in a fit of rage, bashed his brains out, so the nephew was killed by the uncle. And after all of this was over, Eleanor retires to Fontevraud Abbey in France and dies peacefully at the age of 80 in 1204. She's interred in the crypt there, in between the bodies or the coffins of her son Richard and her husband Henry II. Her tomb, on top, the effigy was carved most beautifully and then painted as the latest art as they did in those days. And there, the story should finish. But unfortunately, there was an incident. During the French Revolution, the bodies were disinterred, their bones scattered, never recovered. But the tombs were actually recovered and put back in place. So if ever you go to Fontevraud Abbey and you bend a knee and say a prayer for our long-lost queen and our king and Richard, of course, they're not there. They're empty tombs. But did you know that Eleanor, Queen Eleanor of England, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was the 9th great-grandmother of Henry VIII? Therefore, she is so distant related to my queen, Elizabeth II, and in turn, of course, her son, now King Charles III. But you may be wondering why I've got roses here. There is a bit of a legend that when Eleanor was out on the Crusades, she came across a red rose bush, and it's said that she had a bush of these roses brought with her back from the Crusades and then over to England, where she cultivated them. The rumour is, or shall we say the legend, that this is in fact the Red Rose of Lancaster. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of ours. If you did, like, share and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel further, why not have a look at our Patreon community? There's lots of perks involved in this, and we do have occasional meetups. It is great fun. Now, before I go, the link for that, by the way, is in the description. But before I go, a quick shout out to some of our Patreon members. And as ever, I've got it typed out by my lovely wife, Julie, for me. So, hey guys, thanks a million. James Chilton, Craig Newman, and cannibal lemons. Without you guys, I wouldn't be able to make all of these films. So, from me and from Julie, thanks a bunch. Bye for now.